Would you pray with me? God, who travels with us always, be with us here and now, and be in our words, and be in our thoughts, and be in our spirits. Amen. So I've told you a few times by now that I'm taking a class on the history and polity of our denomination, history and polity of the United Church of Christ, that you're all going to hear about that class too as I share the things that I've learned. There are still 5 weeks left in that class, so get comfortable. Several weeks ago, you might have heard me say that the present-day United Church of Christ was created in 1957 from the merger of two predecessor bodies that were themselves formed from 5 different broad theological traditions. And that process of unification was complicated, and it was joyful, and it was tedious, and it was exciting, and it was a lot of things all at once. Looking back at a distance now of almost 70 years, one of the really interesting things about that moment in 1957 is that the people who were there at the uniting of these traditions were self-consciously trying to create a multiracial church. In 1957, that was not the usual thing to do. In fact, in 1957, and today, if we're being honest, most American religious traditions split along the lines that had been drawn during the period of slavery and during the Civil War. There were Black Methodists and there were White Methodists. There were and are Southern Baptist and Northern Baptist, and some of each were white and some of each were black. The 2 major Presbyterian denominations trace their split back to the mid-1800s, and almost every American Christian tradition in 1957 was still structured based on racial lines and on the Civil War that had broken out 100 years earlier. And the same is still mostly true today. So in 1957, they wanted to create a multiracial church. That seems like a worthy goal that's worth celebrating. That seems like something worth being proud of, and it is, but it was more complicated than that. When it came time to merge in 1957, when it came time for these traditions that were both white and black to come together, one of the sticking points in the merger was that the black churches, the black Christians, were not certain that they could trust the white ones. The black churches and the black Christians were not sure that they could trust the white churches and the white Christians, and they had their reasons. They had a lot of experiences that had taught them that white Christians could not always be counted on to act like they should. They had learned through hard experiences that white church folks, even the ones who said all the right things, they usually acted just the same as all the other white people. I was thinking about that the last few weeks. I was thinking about it because I'm in that class and they're making me think about it. But I was also thinking about it for another couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that this is Black History Month, and so I've been thinking about the role of religion in Black history. More on that in a few minutes. And I've been thinking about that story of the formation of the UCC too because of what has been in the news recently, because of the video that was posted to the president's Truth Social account a couple of weeks ago that depicted the Obamas as apes. I'm sure you've seen the video or you've heard about it. It was an AI-generated video that showed the Obamas as apes, accompanied by that song, "The Lion Sleeps Tonight," in the background. In the jungle, the quiet jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. The president says he didn't post the video, but that a staffer did it by accident. Either way, it's quite an act to post something like that, accidental or not, and it's quite a statement for a president to share a video like that one. That video caused a furor, of course. That video sparked several news cycles full of condemnation and hand-wringing and long think pieces about racism in America in the year 2026. But for all the conversation about the video, for all the discourse about it, I'm not sure any of it contributed very helpfully to the project of resisting racism. I'm not sure that any of the breathless cable news commentators really moved the needle on America's relationship to race, because racism has never been about one egregious act or some especially outrageous thing someone said. Racism does not all come down to whether someone posted a video or not. Racism is a structure, racism is an ideology, it's a cultural operating system, it's a set of assumptions on which our society operates, and it operates whether a prominent person shares an offensive video or not, or whether that person belongs to your political party or not. That's what made those black Christians hesitant in 1957. That's what made them feel uncertain about whether they could ever trust the white Christians. It wasn't something that the white Christians said. They said all the right things. And it wasn't something that the white churches did. The white churches were there, after all, ready to create a new multiracial denomination. They said and they did all the right things. But the systems underneath, the assumptions beneath the surface, the ideology running behind the scenes, that's what gave those black Christians pause. That's what made them think twice about uniting with white churches into a united Church of Christ. The merger happened in the end. The black churches decided that unity was an argument strong enough to overcome their reservations. But they were under no illusions that racism was a thing of the past, even or especially in the church. In this passage from the Gospel of Matthew that Elizabeth just read for us, we hear the story of what we call the Transfiguration. It's the story of how Jesus climbed up a mountain to have a conversation with his tradition. It is the story of how Jesus ventured out expecting a reckoning with the past of his people and to ask how he might fit into that story. The great heroes of Israel's past waited for him there at the top of that mountain. Elijah was there on the mountaintop, and Moses was there too. And the whole story is patterned on the story of Moses going up to the top of Mount Sinai to meet God there and to receive the law from God's hand. At the end of his encounter, that story goes, at the end of the story, Moses' face was transfigured. His face shone, he radiated in the afterglow of God's presence. And the New Testament Gospels tell the story of Jesus going up the mountain in just the same way. When Jesus went up the mountain, he was transfigured too. He too was shining like Moses had shone. The Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospels make a big point of how much Jesus was filling Moses' shoes by traveling up that mountain. There is one big difference, though, between the story of Moses going up the mountain and the story of Jesus' transfiguration. And that difference is that while Moses was sent up the mountain, while Moses was called by God to climb up and meet God there at the top, Jesus decided to go. Jesus, you'll notice in verse 17:1, Jesus undertook this journey on his own. It was his idea. I think this is important because while Moses got summoned to the top of his mountain, Jesus chose an experience of transformation. Jesus anticipated and Jesus chose the change in himself that he knew would come when he came face to face with his own tradition, when he reckoned with the past of his own nation and his own people. It's interesting that Jesus chose this experience not at the beginning of his life, not at the beginning when he was a kid or when he was baptized or when he first began to preach and teach and heal, but Jesus chose this experience of transformation nearer to the end of his life, when he was a mature person who already understood his tradition and his people pretty well, when he understood it well enough to have questions about his place in it. Jesus had lived a lot of life by the time he went up the mountain of the Transfiguration to meet God and to wrestle with his inheritance. He was closer to his end than to his beginning when he chose to be transformed. I read an interesting article last week somewhere, I think it was in The Atlantic, and it was an article about the really big ways that people are framing American history right now on the eve of the 250th anniversary of this country. For a decade or two now, there has been this push to really reckon with America's past, this push to take a full account of America's founding as a set of colonial outposts, to account for the way slavery was essential to the economic logic and therefore the political logic of the colonies and then later the states and the nation, to really wrestle with the legacy of slavery and racism in this nation's history. And the New York Times 1619 Project is probably the most prominent example of that. And then on the other hand, in the last decade or so, there's been this movement to push back against that, to say that slavery in the Americas was not so bad, to argue that the United States was not and is not a caste system rooted in race and skin color. And there have been lots of prominent examples of that perspective. There was a government report designed to compete with the 1619 Project. It was titled the 1776 Report, and it came out 2 days before the end of Trump's first term. That report was designed to cast progressivism and civil rights as corrupting forces in American history, as forces that eroded the genius represented in the moment of the nation's founding. There was an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History about a year ago, which mandated revisions to exhibits at museums like the Smithsonian, and which most recently probably contributed to the removal of the pride flag this past week from the Stonewall National Monument. So there are these two competing views of American history. There are these conflicting understandings of what America even is and what American history continues to mean, and there's a wrestling match going on over how we are supposed to feel about the past. And at the heart of the matter is the present and the future. At the heart of the matter is the question of transformation. Does America need to be preserved? Does America need to be kept intact or restored to truth and sanity, the way it came to us from 1950 or 1850 or 1750? Or does America need to be transformed? Does America need to be remade? Does America need to be reconstituted and reimagined as a more just place by reckoning with the past and striving to make the future different? If we think back to that moment in 1957, when the people in those two predecessor bodies decided to come together, united and uniting, to form a new denomination, I think those people chose transformation. There were ways in 1957, there were ways they could have preserved the past. And there were ways for those 5 different theological traditions to each keep to themselves and keep doing what they had always done. And instead, they chose transformation. There were ways that the white churches and the black churches could have kept abiding by the logic of segregation, and they could have kept separate from each other forever, but they chose unity, even though it was hard for some of them to trust each other. They all chose in that moment. They all chose to face the past head on, and they all chose to journey toward transformation, just like Jesus chose to travel up that mountain, to reckon with his own people and to reckon with his own past. The history of the United Church of Christ since 1957 has shown that the black churches and the black Christians were right to be suspicious. They were right to have their reservations about the white churches and the white Christians because those underlying patterns and structures have not disappeared simply because of a new denominational structure. Their suspicions have been borne out, their fears have been realized, and yet history has also shown that they were right to choose unity. History has also shown that there has been transformation, there has been transfiguration. The choice to seek out some new way of living has brought change. And all of us here today are heirs to that courage. All of us here today are inheritors of that choice to seek out transformation, and we live in the legacy created by their journey. It is Black History Month, and I think it's a fraught time for a church like this one that has been historically and still is predominantly white. It's a fraught time because there's a temptation to declare victory and move on. There's a tendency to claim to be and to have always been on the right side of history. There's the risk of claiming someone like Martin Luther King Jr. without acknowledging that white churches were some of the biggest obstacles he ever had to overcome. It's easy to forget that one of the most important religious and political documents of the 20th century, King's letter from a Birmingham jail, it's easy to forget that that letter was written squarely to white moderate clergy and white moderate churches who only ever counseled not yet and who only ever preached accommodation to systems of oppression. Black History Month, for churches that are still predominantly white, Black History Month is not a moment to pretend to have always been on the right side of things, but this is a moment to seek transformation. But it is also a time to notice that we live already in the midst of transformation. It is a moment to see all the ways God is already changing us. Today, our denomination is living in the beauty of a transfiguration, radiating in God's presence. Our denomination today is that multiracial church that they envisioned in 1957, We are a part of a communion that includes Black churches and white churches and Latino churches and churches that are themselves truly multiracial. In that class I'm taking, there are people leading congregations full of people of Japanese descent, people leading Pacific Islander communities and churches that are reimagining themselves to offer welcome to people only just now immigrating to this country. The United Church of Christ is far from perfect in the same way that the United States is far from perfect. But the United Church of Christ has chosen transformation, and it has begun to be transfigured in the light of God's presence. And that can be an inspiration, I think, for this nation as we wrestle with our past and try to reckon with who we are. And that should be an inspiration for this congregation, for this church, as we choose a journey of transformation, as we choose to reckon with our own past and move toward our own future. The story of Jesus' journey up the mountain of the Transfiguration reminds us that we can always seek change, that we can always look for ways to be made new, and that God always meets us in the moments when we choose to be transformed. Amen.